And we watch Shizuko drifting around the city on her own little adventure, or Kiki as she explores a new, unfamiliar place, or May who wanders around a new place until she stumbles into a magical realm. We, as their audience, become part of an adventure in the backdrop of beautiful cities. Studio Ghibli is known for visuals that elicit a deep longing for places most of us never actually knew but deeply desire to be part of. Visuals of ideal cities, or more realistically, walkable cities. I wanted to talk about these cities and how Studio Ghibli creates them. But before all of that, here's Anson Yu explaining what a walkable city is.
POV, you're an ant, and I'm about to explain to you what a walkable city is. A walkable city isn't just a place where you can walk, although by virtue of the name, that is a pretty big part of it. It's more of a reimagining of what cities can and should be like. The built environment is made specifically for people to enjoy, to spend time, and just to live, rather than built around the whims of the automobile. In fact, most cities today, especially in North America, built their entire infrastructure around automobiles. What happens there is that you have roads that are wider, you have less pedestrian spaces, and overall you have a society that is less cohesive, because if you are prioritizing those that own vehicles, you're deprioritizing those that don't. That makes living spaces, schools, hospitals, libraries, and everything less accessible and less equitable for those who can't afford different cars and vehicles. Also, you get less social cohesion overall. Road rage is when you see some of the best people at their worst. And that's because although you're in a public space on the highway, you're still in a private vehicle. Whereas when you're in a physical space walking, you're entirely immersed in your environment. You're much more likely to interact with art installations, with strangers, and to take in the natural world as well. Like this. But imagine a city where the streets aren't controlled by individual cars, whose infrastructure serves the community rather than the profits of a few communities. Sounds pretty good, right? According to the Walkable and Livable Communities Institute, walkable cities consider persons, not their automobiles, at the center of the design scale. They design communities around the human foot. Places that are socially, environmentally, and economically vibrant. When we have a walkable city, we can go one step further to explore our own experiences walking there. And this was largely thought about in a school of thought called Psychogeography, which is the intersection of psychology and geography. In essence, psychogeographers believe that aimlessly walking and exploring our urban environments is important to our lives. It's a means of counterculture, which opposes the existing methods of enjoyment that are given to us in the forms of advertisement, spectacle, and consumption. Instead, we're presented with the option of reclaiming our city.
Most Ghibli movies aren't just about one person or idea, but also about a person's interaction with the environment.
City people see forests and woods and streams and they're happy because they think what they're seeing is nature. Apart from back deep in the mountains, almost everything you see here is the work of a farmer.
A common theme in Ghibli movies is that an extra attention is paid to the characters in the background, where they're made to do their own work instead of staying stationary, unlike some traditional Western animation movies. This attention to detail is also given to the places where these stories unfold. Ghibli movies often use common themes that explore a protagonist's experiences with their cities, like long shots inside public transit, scenes so peaceful that they arguably subvert the usual stereotype of trains or buses as nuisances to public funds, or the beginning of young love in the backdrop of a city's public library. This focus on the public facilities of a city, along with the active mobility of its characters and features of pedestrian villages, it creates romantic visions of walkable cities in our minds. These cities aren't just the backdrops for our protagonists, but active participants in their stories. Sometimes their designs pushes these characters on to greater adventures, and other times just the simple act of drifting becomes an adventure. Even through a cursory glance, we can see how urban planning in most cities today prioritize cars over humans. In addition to this, the reduction in our public spaces where people are allowed to just be without spending money, it makes acts of aimless drifting or even loitering that much more countercultural. For all its mundanity, it does push back against the slow destruction of our communal and public life. And these aren't new observations by any chance. The activity of aimless drifting, whether in real life or in movies, it has been written beautifully by writers, filmmakers, and academics. When talking about movies where characters get to walk aimlessly, Imogen Sarah Smith wrote, there is a special pleasure in the kind of a traveling shot that follows an actor on foot. When the camera glides along at the pace of someone's stride or saunter, taking in the world at eye level, it represents cinema at its most human, mimicking our daily experiences of the world and humans at their most cinematic. There is a beauty in being able to walk around and observe one city. A city is like a piece of art, and its observer is the one who wanders around it, taking in the minor details, the rawness, the beauty of it all. Only here, the observer of the city is called a flaneur. In the Ghibli verse, Shizuko is our primary flaneur. As Shizuko wanders away from a task she was actually meant to do, she takes us, her audience, into exploring the forgotten and marginalized aspect of her city's urban environment. As these events start getting more absurd, the more enthralled we become with the story and the place it's taking place in. And these themes that romanticize walkable cities, you can also see them in other Ghibli movies, like Howl's Moving Castle, whose backgrounds were actually inspired by cities like Frankfurt and Paris, coincidentally, two of the best performing walkable cities in Europe, or Kiki's Delivery Service, where our protagonist Kiki finds a new home in the fictional town of Koriko, a place primarily inspired by the cities of Visby and Stockholm. The result is a hybridized European city with small town and large city aesthetics, an idyllic European fantasyscape. But why am I connecting these seemingly grand ideas of human centric city planning with a couple of Ghibli films? Well, throughout the last year, as the pandemic ousted nearly every norm of our society, it also binded many of us into the four walls of our homes. Life became lonely, and when the overconsumption of commodities that plagues our lives stopped giving the results it used to, we started craving the most humane object, a community. For thousands, a little evening walk around their neighborhood became the only recreational activity of their day, a sort of reprieve. The importance of cities that allow humans to just loiter around, walk, and exist in public places became obvious. Many Studio Ghibli movies are well known for the comfort they evoke within us, but this time we could put our finger on the why. These visuals brought out our most desperate, primal need for just existing in a place. The visuals behind Ghibli stories aren't necessarily political, but largely a response to Japanese society's post war industrial growth and an echo of Miyazaki's own pacifist views. In a paper titled Hayao Miyazaki's Vision, The Architecture of Studio Ghibli in the Pursuit of Contemporary Utopia, Julia Remington explains how Japanese films have continued creating narratives in response to the nation's changing architectural sphere, seeking the relevance of tradition and nature instead. The utopian visuals of Miyazaki are also expressions of criticisms and desire against contemporary realities, of cities growing more individualistic in the face of industrial profits and changing lifestyles. You see this in a movie like Castle in the Sky, whose location was actually inspired by the abundant Welsh mines and houses after a mining strike happened in the 80s. Miyazaki shows ruined Welsh homes with crumbling stone being overtaken by grasses, seeming to disappear into the landscape, and remodels all of that into a children's fantasy. We need to remember that Ghibli movies are generally targeted to children, And just like other kid centered media, they carry messages of what's ideal, about the kind of societies one must strive for or appreciate. In an interview with Robert Albert, Hayao Miyazaki talked about the gratuitous motions in his movies, where seemingly nothing happens. We have a word for that in Japanese, ma, emptiness. It's there intentionally. It's a pause in time, an interval that holds as much importance as times of rapid actions. It results in some extremely long shots that don't actually contribute to the story's speed in the traditional sense, but instead it gives the characters a chance to think and to breathe. By making its characters discover a new phase in their life through these simple moments, Ghibli shows us that mundanity can also be a way towards true adventure. So, where does all of this bring us? Am I claiming that Ghibli movies make these bold statements about our urban landscape or the condition of human life in contemporary societies? Or am I claiming that they're these grand portals into the kind of societies we must be fighting for? Not really. None of that, actually. Personally, what I was trying to understand was the reason I was so particularly moved and enamored by these cities. And I read a lot about how their creators made them, what inspired them, or even what their particular beliefs were when it comes to how a city should be. But I think the answer was much more simpler. The artists behind Studio Ghibli are masters of their craft, and they're very good in showing the human condition, whether it's through depictions of love, fear, or sadness. The cities just happen to be one of these things. These visuals of ideal cities are a small part in our larger desire to live in cities that foster communities, that prioritize us instead of machines, and just make life happier.